So similar to yesterday, we're going to conclude today's program with a panel discussion titled Evaluating the Viability, Sustainability, and Effectiveness of the Federal Farm Safety Net. We encourage you to submit questions for the panel in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I will be serving as moderator for today's panel, but I do want to introduce our guests today. Joining us today is Amalie Lipstreu, the Policy Director for the Ohio Ecological Food and Farm Association. Amalie has more than 25 years of public and social service experience. She received her Bachelor's of Arts from Hiram College and a master's degree in environmental policy from Kent State University, after which Amalie began her career focusing on agriculture and food systems. She has worked in land use around farmland prevention, including agriculture easement purchase and donation programs, transfer of development rights, cost of community service, and agriculture zoning. Amalie conducted research and advocacy that led to the development of the Ohio Food Policy Advisory Council, which she managed along with the Office of Sustainable Agriculture at the Ohio Department of Agriculture. Thank you for being with us, Amalie. Appreciate it. Next, we have Jonathan McCracken, who serves as the Senior Policy Advisor to Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown. A native of Wilmington, Ohio, Jonathan advises Senator Brown on and develops policy and legislation related to agriculture, food, nutrition, energy, environment, and infrastructure. He has worked for Senator Brown since 2007 and has introduced multiple bills, including the Local Farms Act, the Agriculture Risk Coverage Act, and numerous conservation provisions that were included in the 2018 and 2014 Farm Bills, as well as the 2010 Child Nutrition Authorization Act. He is a graduate of Wake Forest University and the George Washington University Law School. Again, welcome, Jonathan. Thanks for being with us. And then rounding out our panel this morning is Wayne Stoskopf, who serves as Director of Public Policy for the National Corn Growers Association. He covers risk management and tax issues and serves as the lead staff for NCGA's Risk Management and Transportation Action Team. Prior to working at NCGA, Wayne was a senior professional staffer to the Senate Agriculture Committee, where he oversaw commodity programs, crop insurance, disaster assistance, and grain standard programs. He led staff-level negotiations for commodities and crop insurance titles of the 2018 Farm Bill. He was also a legislative assistant to U.S. Senator Pat Roberts and U.S. Representative Lynn Jenkins, both from Kansas, handling agriculture issues. Wayne was raised on his family farm near Hoisington, Kansas, and a graduate of Kansas State University with a degree in agribusiness. Wayne and I go back to our college days, and I'm very excited that he accepted my invitation to be on this panel. I promised to not treat him unfairly to the rest of the two panelists. But Wayne has many awards that recognize his knowledge and depth in food and agriculture policy, including the coveted Friend of Wheat, to back that claim. Thanks for being with us, Wayne. We appreciate it. So to get started, the first set of questions that I'm going to ask you today are going to be related to the coronavirus pandemic. It certainly hasn't been the only thing, but it has been pretty much the dominant force here in 2020, or the thing we're going to look back in 2020 when the year is all said and done. So I'd like to start today by asking each of you to outline effectiveness of specific policies that we saw this year and the effectiveness that we might have witnessed. So Amalie, I'll start with you. In Ohio, we have seen a growing segment of operations of all sizes that depend on additional workers, whether domestic or internationally, to plant and harvest crops. We had a presentation today that showed how the pandemic impacted off-farm labor, but specifically we saw some changes that resulted in extending the H-2A program for workers already here in the United States. How effective were those provisions in meeting some of our labor needs when it comes to a farm level?
Sure, thanks so much, Ben. I think that our farmers that we work with were really concerned about their ability to secure labor early on in the pandemic. But over time, we found that our producers were able to meet those labor needs. It's probably a relatively small number of our producers that use H-2A workers, but for those that do, I would say that most of the concern was really around how to safely and economically house those workers, as well as developing protocols to protect workers from contracting or spreading the virus.
Sorry, you'd think I'd have this figured out to unmute myself, but I apologize. Jonathan, we're going to come to you for this next question. There's a perennial discussion on the appropriate level of funding for nutrition programs, programs that have experienced additional congressionally allocated or authorized funding through legislation such as the CARES Act. For instance, it was passed in March. At this point, how much do we know about the effectiveness of these nutrition programs that we've seen this year? Some of the programs, an example would be the Farmers to Families Food Box program, for instance.
Sure. So I think that's a good question. And I think it's kind of unknowable in some ways, as we're still pretty early on. But I think that the one program that we do know the impact of is SNAP. Because there's so much data on the SNAP program over the years. We know that SNAP is very responsive. It gets out pretty quick. It has the benefit of, making sure families have food on the table, helping out local economies, local grocery stores, markets, that sort of thing. And like I said, it can ramp up really quickly. And so while the different COVID packages didn't have, kind of a SNAP benefit increase per se, there were a lot of, kind of flexibilities in the program that states were allowed to waive. And I think almost every state has taken advantage of these waivers, including Ohio. And so I think, certainly in the early days of the pandemic, that was really necessary to try and get this money to these benefits to as many folks as possible who were experiencing, really kind of unprecedented unemployment in the economy, going from 4 or 5% employment rate to like 16 or 17%, within a month. So that's the value of SNAP. Two other programs I'll quickly talk about. You mentioned kind of the food box program. I think that's a good example of USDA kind of stepping up to the challenge of what was going on kind of across the country. And I think in many ways it was a commodity program as much as a nutrition program. If you think back to what we were seeing on the news back in March and April, there were numerous stories about dairies just dumping their milk, folks plowing crops under, because the market literally went away overnight across kind of the food supply chain. And so I think USDA and AMS at USDA really stepped to the plate to design this program. There were hiccups, no doubt, but I think it really helped served a gap to help out producers and really reach, families. Because I think the other story that we know is there were, newspaper stories and TV reports across the country about food bank lines that stretched miles. So I think that this really had this co-benefit of helping producers and helping out, families who were out of a job all of a sudden or that sort of thing. So I imagine we'll learn more over time, the impact of that. But I think that the program that has really been a huge success that Congress helped create is the pandemic EBT program. And the point of this is, as we saw in Ohio and across the country, all of a sudden school wasn't in session anymore, but you had millions of children who depended on the school lunch and breakfast program for a meal every day. And now they didn't have access to this. And so what the PEBT program does is it sends a benefit to any family that has a school-age child that's in the free or reduced price lunch program. So there's still that kind of benefit, so they're not falling farther behind. And that's a program I think that has been hugely successful. Again, probably some bumps along the way as a new program, but in general, that is one that I think has really been a big benefit kind of across the state and across the country.
Excellent. Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate it. Wayne, we're coming to you next. Traditional farm programs like crop insurance and commodity programs have been dwarfed by federal ad hoc spending to agricultural producers this year. We have seen large ad hoc programs in the past, the late 90s being probably our most recent example of this, when ad hoc spending was a relatively high percentage of total farm program expenditures. We will talk about traditional farm programs going forward a little bit later, but looking at these ad hoc payments, Market Facilitation Program 1 and 2, the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program 1 and 2, do they signal that there's a general consensus or a feeling that maybe our federal farm safety net is deemed to be inadequate?
Well, Ben, thank you for the invitation to join the panel today. I appreciate that opportunity and for the question. Certainly the National Corn Growers and our state affiliates and many of our growers and producers across the country have worked constantly for many years, multiple farm bills, to improve the risk management tools that are available to agricultural producers. When we're evaluating the farm bill and the effectiveness of the safety net, I do think it's a good idea to keep in mind that while it was about 2 years ago that it was passed and signed into law, the first ARC and PLC payments under the 18 Farm Bill were just issued last month in October for the 2019 crop year. Some of the improvements that were made, the PLC yield update provision, for example, will kick in next year for the 2020 crop year, as well as the annual choice starting in 2021. So several of these pieces are still coming online and will be important in continuing to improve those programs. Overall, commodity programs, along with crop insurance, are an important part of the safety net, certainly the cornerstone for producers, and are designed to provide a degree of certainty, predictability for producers, their lenders, to manage their risk between year to year, between a whole host of different issues. In contrast, the market facilitation program really was designed to respond to market disruptions due to retaliatory tariffs. The coronavirus food assistance program was designed to quickly respond to the economic impacts of a global pandemic. Really, those shocks, those issues were not part of the discussions when the lead up to the Farm Bill. We were not anticipating those types of issues. This summer, NCGA worked along with the University of Illinois on an analysis on the impact to corn growers in particular for the 2019 crop and 2020 for COVID, and found that compared to pre-COVID estimates, the 2019 crop year on average revenue would be reduced by $59 per acre and $89 per acre for 2020. And that includes the commodity program adoption or changes, with a lower reference or lower prices triggering a higher reference price for PLC, and certainly triggering some crop insurance revenue programs. The point is that even with the existing safety net, the shock to the system was so great that there would have been a large drop in revenue for producers if those prices were held out throughout the entire marketing year. So the reality is the Farm Bill programs, while important, just do not have the flexibility, speed, and really the resources to quickly adapt to these unforeseen types of events. However, the Secretary of Agriculture does have authority to move more quickly with the authorities governing the Commodity Credit Corporation. So these programs were vastly helpful in helping producers manage through the 2020 crop year. And looking ahead, really no grower should be banking on these types of MFP and CFP or CFAP programs to continue. And I'd imagine that there are going to be many tough conversations with lenders about financing the 2021 crop throughout the rest of the year, with the uncertainty about these additional ad hoc programs.
Thank you, Wayne. We're going to stick with you real quick just for a follow-up. So these ad hoc program expenditures have continued to get larger. We've continued to add more commodities outside of our traditional farm bill program commodities. The payments have also been getting larger. For instance, the first round of CFAP included about 60 commodities. The second round included about 300 commodities. As we look ahead, do we see the policies where these commodities stay eligible for assistance? And then also another question for this is, we've also seen commodity-specific support, where it has been a tradition to where Farm Bill support does not fund a specific commodity. We call them decoupled for a reason, that payments are not tied to what is actually produced. However, we have seen a trend toward that, more commodities and product-specific support. Now, that's against the rules of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. We'll talk about trade tomorrow. But my specific question relates to, do we see support for these commodities that are not normally in the safety net stick around? And then what type of environment are we looking at if we continue this product-specific support?
Sure, and I think USDA has worked overtime to deliver and develop these programs and to be responsive to the types of concerns, particularly from specialty crops and others that were not included in the first round of CFAP to provide additional assistance. Overall, throughout this year, I don't know if rewind to about a year ago, if you'd have expected large payments to livestock producers, large payments to dairy producers, and a whole host of support for specialty crops and the non-traditional development or avenues of delivery certainly have been expanded quite a bit. By no means are any of these commodities in a better space than they would have been without COVID spreading around the world. But that level of engagement with USDA, the Chief Economist's Office, and others to figure out ways to measure impacts has been really critical. For row crops, USDA can use the futures price to calculate damages. Other specialty crops, farmers markets, others have difficulties using futures prices. So the USDA has been working with them. Even for row crops, those prices don't always adjust for local basis concerns, so that they don't always reflect exactly the conditions on the ground, but there's at least a history there of working through those issues. And in terms of direct support, commodity specific support, thankfully I'm not an international trade lawyer and have been working overtime on COVID relief, but the trade space is a difficult question. I think the big questions that will need to be answered is how are all of these supports classified, whether it's amber box, green box, product specific, whether or not they're trade distorting. And the second is, what are the impacts on the de minimis thresholds for commodities in particular? If the programs are indeed temporary, there may be less interest in other countries challenging these programs at the WTO. I think the bigger concern may be the overall trend of the U.S. direct support. Whether or not we exceed our limits once or twice will have a bigger impact on what happens in that landscape. I think that trend of increasing direct support is worrying for a lot of folks domestically and internationally. And that may be more important than the specific programs and their justifications at the WTO level.
Thank you. Emily, I want to give you a chance to respond to this question as well, specifically about the inclusion of a lot of specialty crops into the programs and their continuation moving forward into this federal farm safety net, but also ask about the difference between organic certification. Right now, for most of these programs, organics is not treated any differently than organics. Do we see policies maybe on the horizon that give special support to organic products or different support for organic products versus non-organic products?
Sure, thanks for that question. Yeah, with regard to commodity programs, a major focus is on improvements in insurance products for organic producers, ensuring that there is more and more accurate organic pricing data so that these producers are adequately compensated for their losses, and ensuring that crop insurance programs work for organic producers. One issue that's been on the legislative agenda for some time is RMA recognition of NRCS best management practices and their definition of good farming practice. So, we're pleased to see that there have been some changes to cover crop termination guidelines, but there's definitely more that can be done to ensure that organic and sustainable ag principles are not only not hindered, but supported by federal ag policy. And there are still major organic research needs. For example, there's soil health benefits to leaving covered crops on through the winter, but this can cause some challenges for producers in the spring. Answers are needed for questions like, when is the best time to terminate different kinds of cover crops? What equipment is best suited for different needs? And pardon the pun, but a perennial issue is weed management for growers that don't use herbicides. I would say organic research doesn't just help these organic producers. Answers to this kind of research help all farmers who care about soil health and the long-term health of the land. So some other issues around organic production for the next Congress to consider include transition to organic support. One of the things that was really surprising in the last census of agriculture is that it showed Ohio was second only to California in the amount of agricultural land that's being transitioned to organic management systems. We have a sustainable ag educator on staff that provides one-on-one support for growers moving into this very different paradigm of farming. but more support's needed for these growers, especially as we want to meet different water quality, soil health, and carbon sequestration targets. So this is a voluntary system that can be extremely effective in meeting multiple goals, but has very little dedicated support at the state or federal level right now.
Thank you, appreciate it. Jonathan, we're going to come to you now. So conservation remains a critical part of the food and farm policy area. Did we see conservation policies take a back seat during the coronavirus as Congress worked on some other pressing issues and providing relief to the citizens of the United States at large, but then also to agriculture producers?
That's a good question. I think probably, yeah. I mean, I don't think it was the focus, clearly, right? I think that the focus was on Title I programs and nutrition programs, just because I think they were trying to go quick. So I think I would say certainly conservation I wouldn't say took a back seat. Actually, that's not a focus of this relief package. But I do think maybe it's fair to say it hasn't been a real focus of this administration, to be honest with you, compared to if you look at some of the numbers out there, CRP or what have you, I think the numbers kind of bear that out. But wasn't really a focus. And I mean, I think there were some flexibilities that were given kind of administratively, whether it's on hanger grazing or cover crops, sort of things that Wayne's more fluent on than I am. But certainly as kind of like the big programs, that's not where the focus was. And I think maybe that was okay in a short term when you're really trying to go quickly and get it out, get the dollars out, particularly when I think that it was really an all hands on deck sort of thing at the agency, particularly when we know some of these conservation programs, they take a little bit longer by necessity to make sure we're getting it right and that sort of thing on the farm.
Excellent, thank you. And we're going to stick with you for just a second here. I want to transition the conversation a little bit to more what we could see in the next Congress under a different administration. Mm-hmm. What major issues regarding the supplemental nutrition or SNAP program might we see or will the next Congress consider?
And I think Wayne can vouch for this, but I really see that SNAP is a farm bill issue. I think that historically, we have, and strategically, we've kind of paired together ag policy and nutrition policy. I think that the political thinking being that that's how you get a farm bill done, kind of pairing SNAP together with big commodity program policy or livestock policy. So I don't see that changing anytime soon. Most of the folks in the ag sector, whether it's the organic folks or the anti-hunger groups or the big commodity groups or conservation groups really support that. Kind of those programs working together. So, will there be bills introduced to cut SNAP or change eligibility? Sure, but there are literally thousands of bills introduced every Congress. So, absent, so I think it's kind of a wholesale change to the program. I don't envision that happening, to be honest with you, regardless of the composition of the Congress. Now, I think the open question is if there is another kind of COVID relief package, do you get SNAP issued? Do you get somebody to deal with SNAP there? The House back in, I think, May passed a bill that had a temporary 15% increase of across the board for SNAP recipients. Would that be something that's in play? I think it'd be something more like that.
Okay. Wayne, coming to you real quick. Taxes remain a key issue for many agriculture producers. It's also an issue it was talked extensively about on the presidential campaign trail. What tax-related policies might we see or not see in this next congressional session?
A great question, and one that if you asked me about 2 weeks ago, I would probably have an entirely different answer, given that the Senate control is still contested and really won't be known until January 5th, after the two runoff races in Georgia. But the likelihood of major tax changes has really diminished really across the board if Republicans maintain control over the Senate. That does not mean that tax is completely off the table. Certainly there are going to be issues on the plate for Congress regarding COVID relief, certainly payroll taxes and that relief that's been provided or deferred from the president through executive action. I think looking ahead, the Joint Committee on Taxation keeps track of when tax provisions expire. And I think the current list of provisions that expire for the end of 2020 is around 30 provisions. A handful of others, around 5 or 6, will expire at the end of 2021. So there will be pressure to do a tax extenders package, and that can sometimes be retroactive. And certainly some of the provisions from the 2017 tax reform package that passed largely on Republican votes will start to expire ahead of 2025. And just also keep in mind, I think if the pendulum of concern really swings back towards folks in Congress focused on deficit spending, we may see some tax provisions used as pay-fors with increased spending or to reduce the deficit overall. And so those may be more of a piecemeal process instead of a large tax reform plan that's done at one point. It may happen incrementally. And what those pieces are will largely depend on who is, I think, controlling the Senate, and then what types of spending can reach a bipartisan compromise.
Excellent, thank you. Amalie, we talked about young and beginning farmers yesterday a little in our Ag Finance Day, especially with the Farm Credit folks who have a charter to work with young and beginning farmers. But I know this is an area that OFA works a lot with too. You have your program to help farmers, your course that they can go through to receive some education and training. But I have a specific question related to kind of the other end of the spectrum. Given the large proportion of farmers who are ages 65 and over, should Congress consider policies that address issues unique to this group of producers beyond farm succession?
Thanks for that question, Ben. This is an issue that I really care very deeply about. There's a huge transition of land that has been taking place and will continue in the years to come. And certainly farm succession planning is a huge need in this area. I've worked on farmland preservation for many years, and there are some really creative ways for farmers to use the donation or sale of an agricultural conservation easement combined with legal and tax planning support to ensure equitable distribution of assets to children and also make keeping the land and agriculture affordable. But we need to make this an issue a key priority that we keep advocating for. I would say that the development of a long-term strategic plan for the beginning farmer and rancher development program to identify needs within the program, both regionally and industry specific, and establish consistent funding allocations to invest in innovative multi-year programs that not only train the next generation of farmers, but also build more resilient, climate-friendly, and successful models of farming. We need to make sure that beginning farmer projects are really farmer-driven and reach new audiences and also serve farmers of color who have faced well-documented historical discrimination within USDA programs. It's great that we also have now state beginning farmer coordinators, but this was an additional duty added on to existing USDA staff job descriptions. These positions should really be full-time positions to serve the existing need and to be truly effective. And then I would also say, finally, we have a great program with the Conservation Reserve Transition Incentive Program, or CRP TIP, that can facilitate land transition to next generation farmers. We can really increase the level of outreach, support, and effectiveness of that program by partnering with community organizations that serve farmers and ensuring that all FSA field staff are trained and knowledgeable about the program, as well as land linking resources and partners in their region.
Excellent, thank you. we're going to conclude here with one final question for all of you. We're going to go around the horn, but we've had farm bills, and a lot of this policy does fit in the farm bill. We've had farm bills that have sunsetted, and we've had to ask for extensions to old bills before getting a new one passed, sometimes to the tune of multiple years in advance. The 2014 farm bill being an example of that, when the previous bill sunsetted in 2012. We've also had bills in the past that have been replaced ahead of schedule. So my final question for you is, as we look down the road at farm policy, the current farm bill is set to sunset in 2023. Do we see an appetite in Congress for a new farm bill prior to that date to capture some ad hoc spending and address some of the concerns that we just adjusted? Or are we in for a long haul to where it could potentially be a while before we get some of these these adjustments put into our policy? So basically, I'm asking you the timeline. What can we expect in a timeline now moving forward as we get ready to start this new farm bill cycle? So Wayne, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Jonathan and Amy.
Sure, and this is one that everyone has at the top of their mind as they are looking at the 2021 agenda and planning for really next year, and certainly 2021 and 2022 with the next Congress. I think we'll have to wait and see a little bit how the lame duck session goes. If there is the ability to pass a large COVID relief package, I think that helps clear the plate a little bit for the next Congress. There'll certainly still be a lot of attention on COVID. The same with government funding, whether that's a continuing resolution that's punted to sometime next year, or a larger spending package through the remainder of the fiscal year through September. At this point, we really do not officially know who will be the chair or ranking member on the House side of the Agriculture Committee. And on the Senate side, technically, the Republican member is also not officially known, although folks are presuming it's Senator Bozeman from Arkansas replacing Senator Roberts. But technically, we don't know if that'll be a chair or ranking member position, just really the top of the Republican piece. I think the conversations will absolutely start in 2021. It makes sense for folks to start having hearings and discussing the current conditions with COVID and how the underlying programs have worked or haven't worked, and start gathering input. But in terms of formal legislation, whether there are tweaks and pieces done through the appropriations process or through kind of the typical farm bill, I think we won't really see that until 2022 or really 2023 when the next farm bill expires. So there's the potential that the next election in 2022 will heavily influence that farm bill. So it's a big unknown of when will this start, but more of who is even leading that conversation and what is their drive to get that process kicked off.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, I think Wayne is spot on a lot of that stuff. There are just so many unknowns just in the Congress. And then I would even say, kind of from Wayne's perspective on the commodity side, I mean, I think it's going to take even some more time to sift out, like, what are the long-term impacts of these massive programs from the CCC, of which the likes we haven't seen, I don't know, maybe ever or quite, for a generation, right? So, as folks at OSU and other places and K-State and Illinois are looking at this over the next several months, I think that'll be really interesting. What are the levers we need to tweak in some of these, whether it's Title I programs or that sort of thing. So I just think, between the uncertainty in the Congress and in a kind of a bunch of new folks at USDA, they're going to be figuring out what they want to do and how they want to do it. I think, and I think, maybe one of the legacies in many ways of the Trump-Purdue USDA is really saying, the agency saying, we don't need Congress. We can do a lot on our own, really in a way that I don't think certainly not as widespread as the current administration rather. So what does the new Secretary of Ag, how do they approach that? Whether that's on conservation, whether that's on nutrition, whether that's on, kind of commodity policy or research priorities. I think, that's something worth watching. And then how does Congress assert itself? I think that's a question moving forward for sure. But I do, just to hit on what Wayne said, I think there's going to be some time to figure that out because there are just so many moving parts, in the House and in the Senate, and let alone the executive branch, as we just figuring out, who's going to be sitting in these chairs going forward. And again, that all assumes that we don't have another massive outbreak that this pandemic doesn't continue in a way that it has throughout the year. I mean, that's really the big unknown, I guess, in many ways, even more so than the political questions going forward.
Excellent, thank you.
So wait and see. That's like what a Senate staffer always says, wait and see, right?
Namely, yep.
Okay, well, I would certainly defer to Jonathan when it comes to timing, but I would just say when it comes to the next Farm Bill, there are a lot of opportunities for compromise and collaboration as we move forward. Just a couple of things that I would point out relate to the farm safety net. Iowa and Illinois have already implemented state programs that provide crop insurance discounts for farmers that adopt soil health practices to increase soil carbon sequestration and improve resilience to weather extremes. These are programs that I think serve as models nationally. And I would say, especially as we talk about the specialty crop and the organic producers that we work with, the whole farm revenue protection has been an important and relatively new tool to help diversified farms mitigate risk. The program hasn't been without its challenges, but it's a newer program subject to improvement over time, and it offers a lot of promise. There's still need for more crop insurance agent, adjuster education, online tools to help farmers organize their applications for what is a really complicated program. And I think simplifying that process would have tremendous benefits for farmers, as well as permitting organic price elections and contract price addendums based on actual organic market prices. But I guess in closing, I would just say, the legitimate rationale for public investment in agriculture is that it produces public good. So whether we're talking about clean drinking water, food security, jobs, or other issues, if we invest, it needs to serve that public good. That means the conservation and environment, keeping farms on the land, building rural community, and protecting wildlife or other goals. Those are legitimate parameters when we think about public spending. So certainly, I think given the context that we're in, improving the resilience of individual farms and of the food system, and acknowledging the important role farmers play in sequestering carbon are worthy of action and investment that we can all agree on as we start discussions on the next Farm Bill.
Thank you to all three of you. We really appreciate it. We appreciate you being with us today.